Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity Project. I'm just sitting down to have a conversation with Michael Liebowitz, otherwise known as the Rational Egoist. I'll put a link for his channel in the description so you can check out his work. Michael's very kindly accepted my invitation to have a conversation and a discussion. Michael is an objectivist. I'm a voluntarist, so it'd be interesting to kind of talk about that dichotomy, sort of difference and how we align and how we differ on those things. And also, I'd love to get Michael's thoughts on the Nations of Sanity project. And just before I hand over to Michael, for anyone who's listening who's unfamiliar with the Nations of Sanity project, the Nations of Sanity project is based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. So that's what I'm about, if you like. Yeah, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michael to introduce himself. And thank you once again, Michael, for taking the time.
No problem at all. Very happy to do it. So like you said, I'm an objectivist, but let me just be clear that any views that I express are not representative of any other objectivist or any objectivist philosopher, just in case I get something wrong or state something where I don't agree with other objectivists or with Ayn Rand herself. Uh, the way that I see this discussion, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I do so many of these, it's hard to keep track. But I have a position that objectivism offers the best defense for capitalism, for a free society. And I've put it out there that I believe it offers a better defense than any variant of libertarianism. And I assume that your voluntarism is a brand or a strand of libertarianism. So everything I've said so far, would that be correct? Is
Yes.
that okay with you if we proceed in that fashion? Okay. So the reason that I say that objectivism offers the best defense is because as far as I've come across, and I don't know yet what you're going to put forth, so I'm kind of flying blind, but that's all right. Libertarianism comes in a few different varieties. There's a sort of utilitarian consequentialist argument that is best exemplified, say, by a Ludwig von Mises or Milton Friedman. These are normally economists, economic arguments that you're going to create the best prosperity with a free society. Then you have the Murray Rothbard self-ownership variety, which leads to the non-aggression principle, where nobody may initiate force against anyone else. And you have the Hans Hermann Hoppe variety, which derives from his argumentation ethics. The reason I say that objectivism is superior to all these is because consequentialism is all about politics, but the rest start at politics. They make ethical assertions, but they don't draw on a broader moral theory. Objectivism offers a broad philosophy that it leads from metaphysics and epistemology into ethics, and then the politics are derivative of the ethical system. The ethics leads directly, not in a deductive fashion, but nonetheless, the ethical conclusions lead to the political conclusions. In addition to that, the objectivist ethic of rational self-interest, we extol the virtues of rationality, independence, productivity, honesty, all the types of virtues that are going to allow someone to excel in a free society. So an entrepreneur, a capitalist in a free society, if he follows objectivism, will be given the moral fuel that he needs or she needs in order to succeed, to know that he or she is right for reality, right with themselves. The consequentialist brands, which you're not a consequentialist, I'm gathering, but nonetheless, I will say this, that people are driven by morality, by values. Consequentialist arguments, while I think they're important, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to negate them, but in and of themselves don't offer the kind of fuel that people need in order to really grab on to an ideology. This is why I think that you have in the libertarian world, your Hans Hermann Hoppe's and Murray Rothbard's get far more traction than, say, David Friedman does. So with that, that's my elevator pitch, and I'll turn it back to you, Matthew.
Yeah, that kind of tracks with my understanding of objectivism. I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but my kind of view of it has always been that it's kind of obviously has a lot of similarities with libertarianism, with certain common principles with regards to like a free society, the notion of liberty. The non-aggression principle at least seems to feature in objectivism, but doesn't seem to be well, I mean, just to kind of introduce myself as a libertarian, or what variant of libertarian I am, because yeah, there are different kind of branches of libertarianism. I do come at it more from the moral point of view, although I don't, like you, I do see the value in a lot of the consequentialist arguments and the utility, you know, because they do, a lot of them ring true, but they're not the point for me. The point for me is the moral core, the kind of moral truth that underpins it. And I mean, I consider myself a voluntarist, but yeah, that is a branch of libertarian. I would characterize it as just kind of a consistent libertarian. I always say like an anarchist is just a consistent libertarian, and a minarchist is an inconsistent one, because obviously they want a little bit of what we're supposed to be against. And I kind of feel like objectivist is kind of similar to minarchism in that sense. I know it's a broader philosophy in regards to other elements of like, rationalism and self-interest and stuff like that, which, libertarianism doesn't really deal with. It just deals with the kind of what your rights are, and that's the end of the conversation. How you live your life is not really something that libertarianism comments on, whereas I feel like objectivism has a little bit to say on that. But when it comes to the actual principle, like our common principle, if you like, which seems to be the non-aggression principle and the concept of individual self-ownership, as well as the property rights that come from that concept and principle, which underpins free market capitalism. But I feel like my critique of objectivism, if you like, and the reason why I'm not an objectivist or haven't been drawn to it, is I feel like it suffers in the same way as minarchism, of just kind of not keeping consistent with that principle, in the fact that you want a little bit of government. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. This is just my understanding of objectivism, and from objectivists I've spoken to, they generally disagree with most initiations of force and enforce the non-aggression, agree with the NAP in most senses, but do make the exception when it comes to giving government a monopoly on force. Whereas obviously as a voluntarist or an anarchist, or what I would characterize as a consistent libertarian, we say that no, you can't have any of that. The non-aggression principle needs to be kind of universal and consistent. So what do you think of that?
So I think that we can break down this discussion or debate into two parts. The first part is the ethical argument that we absolutely need to have. And then the second part is, given that you and I both agree on rights, the question is going to be what renders rights most secure. And my contention is going to be that a government limited by a constitution to the protection of rights renders rights more secure than an anarchic society. But first, I think it's necessary that we address, like you said, okay, the non-aggression principle. In objectivism, there's not the non-aggression principle. There's the idea that the initiation of force is evil. And there's the idea that the purpose of government is to protect rights. The problem here for libertarians, and maybe you're going to do it, but I'd be very surprised if you did, our right is a moral concept. Right means a moral claim to something or a just claim to something, but you can't just postulate that midstream. You have to have an ethical theory from which to derive it. How do I have a moral claim to something if I don't have a moral theory? Objectivism provides such a moral theory. So unless you're going to go do more than what Hoppe does and Rothbard does, then you're going to end up sort of floating, detached from anything else. So that's the main question right now, I think, is how do you arrive at the non-aggression principle? What ethical system, what ethical theory leads you to that?
I mean, I kind of disagree with I'll answer that question, but I disagree with the characterization, because I feel that libertarianism does provide that. But for me, it basically comes from the way I view morality is, I can't objectively say that morality is a thing. Like I know you're familiar with the is ought issue, and
Sure.
we can perhaps talk about that. And I'm very much of the belief that you can't overcome the is ought issue. You can't get an ought from an is. You need at least a hypothetical imperative or a presupposition to get you from your ises to your oughts. But once you've done that, so when people say, "Oh, do you believe in objective morality?" I kind of have to answer it with a caveat by saying, "Well, I don't believe that I can say morality exists objectively, but I can say that if morality exists, if we presuppose morality or have the hypothetical imperative that we want to find a moral framework, so once we bring morality into the conversation, from that point onwards, we can identify an objective standard of morality through the conceptualization of rights based on individual self-ownership. And what I mean by that is the concept of rights is incoherent without individual self-ownership. Like, you can't have right over anything if you don't have right over yourself. So when people kind of make positive right claims and you say, well, where does that basis come from? It has to come from self-ownership. So in a way, I am, and I don't know if I am guilty of the same as Rothbard in the sense, but I am kind of starting with self-ownership, if you like, as my presupposition, but I'm justifying that by saying that it's the only presupposition that provides a coherent framework for rights. Like, if you, like, I don't know if you've ever come across like one of those logical flowcharts where you answer a yes or no question and it takes you in different directions, logically with the next question, and then you go to your conclusion. And from my point of view is, when you come to individual self-ownership, if you reject it, then you cannot make a coherent conceptualization of rights. Like, from that point on, it just falls underneath itself. Whereas if you accept individual self-ownership, then you have an internally consistent, objectively identifiable and universalizable standard of morality and rights. And that's kind of like the moral truth of it. It reveals itself to be a moral truth, even though I can't say that morality itself, I can't objectively prove morality itself, but I can objectively prove self-ownership within, after the presupposition of morality. Does that make sense? Sorry, I was a bit all over the place.
No, it does not. And here's why. Because you're starting with the presupposition that there's rights, and you're saying, well, because there's rights, the only way to get to rights is if we have self-ownership. Therefore, we have self-ownership. And then from self-ownership, you're going to prove rights. So you end up going in a circle. But you haven't demonstrated that self-ownership is a legitimate concept. Ownership presupposes the concept of property. To have a right to property, you have to have rights. But right is a moral concept. If you can't objectively tie that to morality, then self-ownership is nothing. I mean, who cares? You said, well, if you don't have self-ownership, you can't advocate for rights. Well, so what? What if there's no such thing as rights? Jeremy Bentham said that rights are nonsense on stilts. So it may just be that there's no rights at all. We can't just say, well, we like the idea of rights, therefore self-ownership. You have to prove it. Prove that we own ourselves. Demonstrate it. You can't just postulate it.
Well, I mean, and I'd be interested to see how you solve this problem. But from my point of view, you have to presuppose morality, because the thing is, I can objectively tie self-ownership to morality, but I can't objectively tie morality. Like, I can't overcome that is-ought problem. That's what I'm saying. Like, I need to add. I mean, how do you, if you think
I
you
get
can?
you, but then there's no such thing as rights. They're just an invention of human beings. If you can't overcome the is-ought gap, then there's no such thing as rights. There's no such thing as self-ownership. They're all just fantasies.
Well, yeah, well, that's a fair point. But what I would say about that is, because rights is just a concept. So let's put it this way: if I'm having a conversation with somebody who rejects the idea of morality and rights altogether, they just say there's no such thing as morality. Might makes right, and what will be will be. I admit that I cannot argue against that. I'm basically saying, okay, well, I can't prove to you that morality is a thing. I can't objectively demonstrate that. But what I can say is, if morality is a thing, then I can objectively demonstrate self-ownership. But I need the hypothetical imperative of morality, or this presupposition of morality, however which way you want to kind of bridge that is-ought gap. But I need something to bridge that is-ought gap, because there's no other way of doing it. So basically, what I'm saying is if we want to have rights, because yes, I mean, someone could reject rights altogether and I can't argue with them. But what I can say is, if we have rights, rights can be either arbitrary and incoherent, or they can be coherent and consistent. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's my justification. I can't justify rights out of nothing, but I'm saying that if rights is a thing, if there is such a thing as morality at all, once we've stepped into that realm, then I can play the objective game. Does that make sense?
But that's not an objective game. pure invention. There's just no such thing as rights in your world. You're just saying if we make believe that we have rights, then we have self-ownership because that proves rights. But the idea that if we have morality, we have rights, well, you'd have to have the correct morality. If Christianity is correct, if Islam is correct, you don't have the type of self-ownership that you're talking about. If utilitarianism is correct, you don't have self-ownership, you don't have rights. So you would have to identify the correct morality, if there is such a correct morality that corresponds to rights, if there is such a correspondence. But you've got to do a lot of proving before you get to that point. I mean, and this is kind of my very problem with libertarianism. It isn't just that it lacks a moral theory, it's that it postulates moral concepts, but then doesn't validate them. And that's what needs to be done. If you're going to argue for self-ownership, for the right to property, for my right to life, the right to take actions, then it has to be tied to a broader moral theory. In libertarian, there's just isn't any. Now, some people will respond and say, well, that's okay because libertarianism is just political. Well, that's fine, but then stick to political. But once you start talking about rights, you're now bridging to ethics. You can't have that concept unless you have ethics.
Okay, I mean, I'll be interested to hear how you think objectivism solves this, because I don't see how anything, like I feel like I'm the problem that you're saying I'm not overcoming is an unovercomable problem with regards to the is-ought gap.
Okay.
So,
Okay, okay,
yeah.
so we have to agree then that libertarianism is defeated on its face. That there's no moral, that it doesn't attach to morality, it can't have rights, it can't have self-ownership. What remains to be done then is for me to demonstrate that objectivism does have an objective moral theory that does lead directly to rights.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm not quite there yet because,
But how not?
well,
If you've conceded there's no such thing as self-ownership, you've conceded there's no such thing as rights. You've said you have to invent them or assume that they exist, but they really don't, you said.
yeah,
How
but
doesn't that defeat self-ownership? I mean, it just does.
because there's still a logical truth to self-ownership. It's because the thing is rights and morality. It's all just concepts. Like I say, I mean, the reason why I don't want to just say, oh, well, libertarians defeated it and let's see objectivism have a try, is because I'm trying to get a better feel of what you think it is that's defeating libertarianism by hearing what it is that objectivism is bringing, kind of that libertarian doesn't in this sense.
Sure, but I don't need objectivism to defeat libertarianism. It's irrelevant. The fact of the matter is, right is a moral concept. If
Yeah.
you don't have a morality to attach it to, then you can't have rights. Not in the sense that we're talking. I mean, you can have the government or somebody else make a law that says you have a right to do this, but in the sense that we're talking about is individual rights that exist independent of state authority. Once you've said that you can't bridge the is-ought gap, there is no objective morality. If there is no objective morality, there's no objective concept of right, and you have no argument to say why I shouldn't steal from somebody or why I shouldn't kill somebody or why somebody shouldn't kill me. It's just a matter of opinion. You don't like it.
Well, I mean, I can say that you don't have the right to do those things
No, you
because,
can say I don't have a right, but nobody has the right to stop me either. There are no rights. You just do. I just do, and they just do.
well, I mean, yeah, well, I was trying to make sure I understand that, but the thing I'm struggling with is because you keep saying that I can't tie self-ownership to morality, but from my point of view, the way I'm understanding it is the problem isn't that I can't tie self-ownership to morality. I believe I can do that, but what you're saying is that my morality itself isn't tied to anything. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, you haven't tied it to a morality, and you've said that morality itself is impossible. You've said that you
Well,
cannot
no,
bridge
no.
the is-ought
I,
gap. There can be no objective morality. If there can be no objective morality, then what are you tying it to?
well,
I mean,
no.
you haven't tied
Yeah.
it to
Okay.
anything broader, but it would be impossible to do so because what you needed to tie it to doesn't exist by what you've said.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. I mean, basically, what I'm saying is I I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. From my point of view, and I'm trying to understand how I'm sort of get wrong on this. So please bear with me. But
Mhm.
I'm I'm tying the like I'm the thing is I don't think that the is ought gap makes like I don't think because I can't bridge the is ought gap, that doesn't disprove the existence of the ought. It just means I can't objectively identify the oughts from the ises. You know what I mean? Like I'm just saying I can't get from here to there. There is just no way with only ises, without any hypothetical imperatives, without any presupposition, without any kind of you need to find if there is such a thing as morality or any kind of thing like that. If all you've got is ises, then no one can just say, okay, well, all these ises tell us some kind of ought. They don't. There's no facts that we can point to that give us like the ought of morality. So I just feel like that's an unovercomable hurdle. But what we can do is we can still presuppose morality. So we can say, okay, well, if there was such a thing as morality, like if morality exists at all, is there any kind of objective standard that we can identify? So once we have bridged the is ought gap by adding this hypothetical imperative or the presupposition of bringing morality into the game, then I can then provide a objective tying to morality to self-ownership.
But why self-ownership? Why can't I then invent my own morality and deduce conclusions from it? And imagine if I were to say this to you. Let's make this more concrete. What if I were to say to you, okay, it's true that I can't jump off a 3-story building, flap my arms, and fly, but let's assume I do. Let's assume I can. Now I can go from the house that I'm in to the house down the street because I can fly there, because we've already assumed I can do so by flapping my arms. When I jump, I'm going to smash myself into the floor, right? It doesn't seem that way with morality because it's an abstraction, but it doesn't mean it's any less false to say, well, we're just going to assume it or postulate it. You still have to demonstrate it's true. Like I would have to demonstrate that I can flap my arms and fly.
Okay, well, it's a little bit like with maths. If you were like calculating how much fuel you needed to get a rocket to the moon or something like that, and you were bringing in like maths, like if this much fuel gets us this far, then this much fuel gets us that far. So for example, I know this isn't a perfect analogy because maths is also demonstrable. You know, you can obviously demonstrate
well,
it.
that I was just going to say that. So you're going to give me an example where something is objectively demonstrable. You can't prove something that's not objectively demonstrable by going to an example that is objectively demonstrable.
Yeah, but in the reason yeah, that's why this analogy is imperfect. But the reason why the analogy still has some value is it's not just the demonstrable element of it. You can also calculate it like logically. Like I can say 2 + 2 = 4 because I know it and it's an easy sum. But I can also get 2 things and another 2 things, add them together, and then count what it equals and demonstrate that 2 + 2 does indeed equal 4.
Yeah.
But let's say we were dealing with more abstract equations and numbers that we can't sort of demonstrate very easily, or like we're dealing with bigger numbers than we've got things.
But they still would be demonstrable. You still could test them, and they still would be provable.
Well, you could, yeah, but you could still.
You're not. What if you were to? The analogy would be better, Matthew, if you were to say, what if we were to just make up some numbers that we know don't exist, but let's assume they exist, tie them into the calculations to get us to Mars, and then send a shuttle? What's going to happen?
Well, that's kind of the point I was getting at, is because what I'm saying is like, say we were going to do it with maths. If we say 2 + 2 = 4, let's forget the demonstrable part of it. We can also calculate it. We can also do sums based on that. Like, so we accept there's this concept of maths. We accept that 2 + 2 = 4, and based on that, we do all these other calculations, presupposing that 2 + 2 does indeed equal 4. And what I'm saying is apart from the demonstrable element of it, as we go ahead, maths works. So that kind of also shows, that's the other part from the demonstration part of it, of showing, adding up. We've also got the calculation aspect of like saying, okay, 2 + 2 definitely does equal 4, because when we go ahead with maths based on that presupposition, it all works and it all fits together. And
you can test it.
Whereas if you said 2 + 2 = 5, for example, even if you didn't disprove it, it won't work with your future calculations. Everything won't. And that's my point about. So that's how I wanted to bring it back to the self-ownership thing. It's not a perfect analogy, but that's my point about self-ownership. If you presuppose self-ownership is your basis for rights, just like you would 2 + 2 = 4 for maths, then everything works. Like your rights are consistent and universalizable. There's no contradictions that come out
But
from
Matthew, with
sorry, go on.
math, you started with a fact. 2 + 2 = 4. Now you're starting with something that's not a fact and something that you're saying is impossible to arrive at. You've said that you cannot cross the is-ought gap. If you can't, there can be no morality. If there can be no morality, there can be no moral concepts. By that logic, I can postulate a morality that says, well, if we just say that Michael Liebowitz is the highest being on the planet, well, then we can go on from there to demonstrate that everybody should serve me because we've assumed it. But it's obviously not true. You can't just start midstream, postulate something, and then derive conclusions from it. It doesn't work that way. You have to demonstrate your theory.
Yeah, but the problem is morality isn't facts. Like, and the thing
That's
is,
fine. Okay, but then that's where we are now. That's why I said okay. I disagree. But if that's where we are, if we arrived at that point where you're saying morality is not a fact, therefore libertarianism is not drawn from a broader morality, then libertarianism in any variant that requires self-ownership or the NAP, they're all defeated.
well, I mean, I don't see, I don't
It's
think
a
that
tough pill to
follows.
swallow. I get it. I
I'm,
get
I'm,
it, but
I'm
but
happy
it's
to,
just
well, I'm happy
but
to
it's
swallow tough pills if I accept, if I can recognize that it's, a pill to swallow. But my point is the fact that I can't say that morality is a fact
Mhm.
itself is kind of in my mind it's not defeating anything, because that's just a simple reality that would defeat everything if that was the standard for defeating things. My point is if we presuppose morality, then I can give you self-ownership as a fact from
Are
morality.
you are you familiar with Pascal's wager?
I've heard of it, but I don't know what you
So
might remind me
Pascal,
what it is.
Blaise Pascal says that if you don't that you should believe in God. He says if you believe in God and there is a God, then you go to heaven, right? But if there is no God and you believe in God, well, nothing happens. Whereas if you don't believe in God and it turns out there isn't a God, well, nothing happens. But if there is a God, you suffer the penalty, you go to hell. The problem with Blaise Pascal is which God? Which God do I have to serve? There's hundreds of them, thousands. There's multiple religions, multiple sects within those religions. Which one do I choose? You're saying if we presuppose morality. Okay, but that's not the case. We have to presuppose the specific morality that you're talking about. But why can't I presuppose a different morality? Why do I have to presuppose the morality that leads to the conclusions that you want? Why can't I presuppose the ones that lead to the conclusions I want, or somebody else to the conclusion she wants?
Because that's the only one that seems to be coherent from what I can gather. Like if you don't have self-ownership, rights becomes incoherent. So that's why
Rights
I
are, but why do you need rights? Who says rights are true? You're assuming rights to get to self-ownership, but that's the very thing in question. You have to demonstrate these things. You like rights, so you say this is how we get to them. But I'm saying I don't care about rights. This is my morality. I'll get somewhere else. And how can you defeat me?
well, I mean, I do well. I don't think I can defeat somebody who rejects rights and morality. Are you saying if you reject rights but not reject morality?
I'm saying you could certainly. You could accept a utilitarian ethic and say like Jeremy Bentham, like I said earlier, rights are nonsense on stilts.
Well, I mean, I suppose to give you another example, just to kind of help you see my perspective on this, is imagine I'm not a Christian, but imagine I was a Christian and I believed in the golden rule, which is
Sure.
obviously a much higher standard of morality than
Mhm.
the non-aggression principle. In fact, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard someone tell me that the non-aggression principle is similar to the silver rule. I don't know if that's a real thing, but because I just heard it from somebody and they might be talking nonsense. But my point is imagine I was a Christian and I believed in the golden rule. I believed in morality and I believed God gave us all of these things. But I
Mhm.
might also believe in the non-aggression principle. Let's say I'm a libertarian Christian. Now, if I was coming to you and I was, describing my morality to you, I would say, look, I believe in these things. And you say, well, how do you know these things? I'd be like, well, I take a lot of it on faith. All of my golden rule stuff is just,
Goodbye.
it's just faith and it's just belief and all the rest of it. But,
Goodbye. The
but
conversation's done at that point.
yeah,
I'll
but
put my faith in what I want, and now we
well,
come
hang on,
to a
hang on, hang on.
disagreement.
I'm mid sentence. What I'm saying is yeah, and that's why I say, yeah, you can. That's why you can say goodbye to Christian ethics and things like that, because it's subjective. And even if I believe that, and I do have higher morality than just the non-aggression principle, but I can't objectively demonstrate it. I can't objectively demonstrate. I can't give you an objective basis for why you should help an old lady across the street, for example, like to follow the golden rule. I mean, even though I'm not a Christian, I kind of believe in the golden rule. I think that's a very, that's a morality that appeals to me. But it's subjective. It's my preference. It's not objectively grounded morality.
Okay.
Whereas the non-aggression principle is objectively grounded morality.
How?
But
How?
morality itself is not objectively grounded. And I know that sounds like a
You can't
contradiction,
get
but
you can't get something objective from something non-objective. How, in what way is the
yes, you
non-aggression
can,
aggression
because
principle? Show me, how is the
okay,
non-aggression
well,
principle objective?
I'll give you an example of how you can get something objective from something non-objective. If I said
I
to
want you
you
to
that,
use the non-aggression
oh,
principle. I
okay,
want
all
you to
right.
show me how the non-aggression principle is an objective moral fact, given that you've said you cannot cross the is-ought gap. How can you tell me I ought not to use aggression against somebody else?
Without bridging the is-ought gap, you say?
Yeah.
Well,
You're
I
saying
can't do that.
no, but and that's why you can't have a non-aggression principle. You can't tell me it's wrong. I ought not to initiate force against somebody, and at the same time tell me you can't cross the is-ought gap. What you're doing is saying there is no such thing as an ought, but you ought to do this or you ought not do that.
I'm not saying there is no such thing as an or. I'm saying I cannot prove as a fact that there is such a thing as an
All right,
ought,
but then, well,
but
then
I
if you
can
can't prove
prove
it,
as
you
an
can't
fact.
assume.
But I can prove as an fact that if there is such a thing as an ought, then the non-aggression principle was objectively tied to
Okay,
that. So that's
if
what I'm
there is
saying.
such a thing, if there is such a thing as an ought, prove to me why the non-aggression principle. That in and of itself is disqualifying because you've already rejected oughts. But I'll play
I'm
the
not
logic game
rejecting
with you.
oughts, though. I just want to clarify
No,
that. I'm not
but you
rejecting
but
oughts. I'm just
you
saying I
said you
can't.
can't cross the is-ought gap. If you
Yeah.
can't, then you are rejecting oughts. Now you're telling me, but okay, if we assume there's such a thing as oughts, then the non-aggression principle. Normally, I don't even like to do that, but I don't like to, once you've conceded the other part. But just here, let's assume there are oughts. Why is the non-aggression principle one of them?
Okay. So if we assume there is oughts, then
Hmm.
if okay, so if you have right over yourself as an individual,
Well, you can't get, you're not there yet. You're saying that from oughts, you can go to the non-aggression principle. From the very concept of ought, that leads to non-aggression principle. Why?
well, no, actually, from ought it leads to self-ownership, and the
Okay,
non-aggression
show me
principle
why.
is
Why
the
does
principle
ought
from
lead to self-ownership?
by by virtue of the fact that self-ownership is the only step you can take to a coherent framework for rights. Like,
But we're not at rights yet. We're not even talking rights.
but rights is
You're
morality, though.
no, rights are a moral concept.
Yeah.
Rights aren't you have to have morality to get to rights, but you said morality is impossible. Then you said, well, if we postulate oughts, we'll get to self-ownership. How? How are you going to take me from it just because there's such a thing as ought and then assume that that self-ownership is one of the oughts?
Well, I'm not saying morality is impossible. I'm saying I can't prove morality as a
But
fact.
okay, you can't prove it. That's
Yeah.
fine. You can't prove morality. If you can't prove morality, you can't prove your moral conclusions.
Well, I can prove my moral conclusions if we presuppose morality.
Okay, presuppose morality. Now prove your moral conclusions.
Okay. The proof of self-ownership is in what follows from it, though. That's the problem. I know you're saying, well, you can't start from
But
self-ownership.
okay. Well, then prove what follows from it.
It's a little bit like the Big Bang theory in science, where they say that they can prove everything that happened from the Big Bang, but they can't prove what caused the Big Bang, or they can't prove the Big Bang itself, but they can prove everything that happened from that. It's kind of the same with self-ownership. What I'm saying is if we start with self-ownership, everything fits and works, and if we don't, then it doesn't. And that's,
Well,
for me,
but
the
I could
proof
come
of
up
the
with a
moral
morality
truth.
where everything fits and works.
Could you give an
It just
example?
won't be the one you like.
Well, can I give an example, though? Because every other
Okay.
morality I find
All
where
right, this is the morality. Everybody should give Michael Liebowitz money. That's the moral thing to do. Now I can put the oughts out there. Everybody should give me money. And if they don't, then they're violating the ought. I assumed an absurd morality and I can make it internally consistent. Either you give me your money and you do the right thing, or you don't and you do the wrong thing.
But what would be
But what the hell does that matter? It's just an arbitrary assumption.
Yeah.
Just like in the case you're talking about, self-ownership is just an arbitrary assertion. It doesn't mean anything.
I think it's because from what I'm saying is that you can't make a rights argument that rejects self-ownership. So from my point of view, and maybe I shouldn't say morality, maybe I should just say rights, but from my point of view, the truth of self-ownership when it comes to the conversation of rights is in the fact that it's the only basis for rights that works.
But so what? Who says there's rights?
Well, like I say, I mean, no one, I guess. You know what I mean? I can't, I mean.
And again, as far as you're concerned, then your libertarianism ought to be defeated.
Well, no, because then that's making a moral claim. You know what I mean? I mean, what I'm saying
It's not.
Or,
It's not. What it's saying is that you have no basis. You have no basis to hold the viewpoint that you do. You're right. I shouldn't say ought. I should just say there's no basis for you to hold the view that libertarianism is correct. It's true. I can't tell you you shouldn't hold it, because that would be a moral claim. Good catch. But nevertheless, you have no basis for that viewpoint.
Well, I mean, I think
now, if you want to get to objectivism, and maybe you can try to challenge me, that'd be fine too.
Okay. Well, I mean, that might help me see a little bit better your criticisms of libertarianism, because I am trying to understand.
Well, let's define ethics to start with. Ethics. Okay. I'm going to use ethics and morality synonymously. In English, they basically are synonyms. There's no reason to get crazy. If we want to refer to morality, that's fine. But it just flows from in my brain as when I'm speaking. If you have an issue with that, we'll just use morality, and that'll be fine.
No, that's fine.
What is morality in your view? Tell me what it is.
Well, it's the ought. It is that ought. When we talk about the is ought thing, it's ought. It's what you ought to do. It's.
But okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of a more expansive definition, and you tell me if you accept it. Okay. Morality or moral systems are systems or codes of morality that guide human behavior. They're codes of values that guide human behavior. The values being the ought. Things have value. That's where the ought comes in. They're right and wrong pursuit of values. That's what ethics are. I mean, we can Google it and look it up if you want, but ethics deals with values.
Yeah, I don't have a big objection to that.
Okay. Value in the context that we're speaking of it, there's multiple definitions. A value, for instance, can be what you value, what you happen to want, right? But in the sense that we're using it, a value can be defined as any object or quality desirable as a means or end in itself. Desirable meaning worth seeking. This object is worth seeking. So what gives rise to the concept of something that is worth seeking? Well, of good or bad, of value. What gives rise to the concept of desirable as a means or ends in itself?
Well, that's just a subjective thing, isn't it?
Well, it's not. What is good for you?
Well, that would depend on my subjective value.
Well, it depends on a lot of factors, but there's things that are objectively good for you, right? Like, I mean, that there's things that are good for you. There's things that harm you. There's things that are good for me. If you want to use something else, you can use, do you have a dog?
Yeah.
Okay, what is good for the dog?
Would you mean like good for their health or good for their life?
Good for it. Like, yeah, good for it. When you look at the dog, there's certain things that you would say are good for it. There's certain things you would say are bad for it. You don't want it to eat chocolate, for instance. That would be bad for the dog. Now you have certain foods that are good for it. You want it to have meats, proteins, that sort of thing. You want to keep its weight down. It has to get exercise. Those things are good for it, right?
But are we not presupposing morality when we say good, though?
No, because you're having you have a legitimate measure at this point, right? Once you, because if you were to ask the question, what is desirable? What is worth seeking for my desk? What would your answer be?
Well, again, it would be totally subjective.
Nothing. My desk can't seek.
Oh,
right?
right. Oh, I see. I thought you meant from your point
Right?
of view, but
My
yeah,
my my
okay.
desk can't seek. My desk can't do anything. With life, you have something that has to act in order to stay alive. And as it takes those actions, there's certain things that are good for it, there's certain things that are bad for it. Now, when you have dogs or you have cats or you have plants or any other life form, these things don't have the capacity of reflection. They don't have the capacity of free will like human beings do. Human beings have to discover we have to discover and choose the things that are good for us or bad for us. We can choose wrong. I can choose heroin. I can choose liquor. I can choose an abundance of things that are objectively harmful to me that any doctor would tell me to avoid, right? That's why we need ethics because we don't come with a roadmap. We don't come with instructions telling us what we need to do. We have to learn them. We have to discover them. We have to implement them. We have to discover those values, those objects in life that are worth seeking, that are desirable as a means or end in themselves.
Why do we
That's why
have
we
to?
have ethics, because otherwise you die. Once you have life, you have something that can go into existence, that comes into existence, goes out of existence, and has to act in order to maintain their existence. Inanimate objects don't have that problem. Living objects do, and human beings have the specific problem that we have to learn, discover, and choose those things that are good for us.
I mean, I don't want to derail the thing to our conversation too much with the animals point. I'm not sure I agree with the difference you described there between animals and humans. Um,
You think animals have
but
free will? Do
yeah,
animals
well,
reflect on
yeah,
what's right or wrong? Do animals to say, should I do this? Should I do that?
to varying degrees. I think the difference between animals and humans is more a difference of degree than it is of kind with regards to a lot of this stuff.
Okay, well that's
It
fine, but
depends
would
on the
you agree
animals,
that
but there's a lot of
human beings,
crossover.
but human beings have a conceptual faculty. We have the possibility to reflect on ourselves, to look into our environment, to choose what we want to do. We also have the power to choose those things that are bad for us, that will legitimately harm me, whether it be a food, a relationship, a substance, whatever. I have to discover what's good for me, but that's not enough. I then have to choose it.
Yeah, I just don't think that necessarily separates us from
I don't
animals.
want to
But
get bogged down in the
okay,
animal
yeah, I don't
stuff
want to either. But also,
because that's gonna take us far afield. The
yeah,
point of the matter is that we have to choose,
but
that
are
we
we
have to
not?
discover what's
Sorry.
good to us. But that's what gives rise to the subject of ethics. That's what gives rise to the concept is that human beings have to choose how to live. We have to choose and discover what to do. So then the question is, what should I do? Well, that depends, right? That ultimately depends. Do I want to stay alive? Right? So the entire construction is dependent on wanting to live. But once you say, I want to live, and I would argue that's the default choice coming into it, once we're here, we want to stay here, right? Barring some extreme whatever, that's the default choice. And as long as that's our choice, an abundance of oughts flow through it. Now, it doesn't have to be a specific ought, like if I want to live, I have to go to the gym every Tuesday at 3 o'clock. You know what I mean? You're not going to get that because there are some choices open to us as far as what's good for us. Fruits and vegetables. Well, which fruits and vegetables do I want to eat? But nonetheless, fruits and vegetables are good for us. There's foods that harm us. This is ethics, and that crosses the is ought gap. What a thing is determines what it ought to do. If it's conditional on the decision and the desire to live. But ethics is a code of values to guide our living. So once we're there, we've already made the choice. We're already deciding to live. If we wish to live, there are things we ought to do. And if you get into fundamentals, there's fundamental things that we ought to do. But I don't want to get too much into that. All I'm trying to establish is that we can have an objective code of values.
Okay, but I don't think you did bridge the is-ought gap any better than I did because you've still added the hypothetical imperative of if we
Hold
need to
on.
want to live
Yes,
and
but I never said that that was unacceptable. There's no reason that's unacceptable. That's only acceptable if we expect morality to be imposed on us from some outside force, right? If we say, well, morality has to be dictated to us by something, something has to come and make us have to do these things. It's just a reality. It's just what existence requires. The fact of the matter is, human life requires certain things. And those things are good for us. That is, by definition, values. And if a code of ethics is a code of values, we have a code of ethics. We've bridged that gap with a single decision. Once you decide to live, there's things you ought to do. There's no getting around it. And anybody that once we get further afield and further down the line, when we get to politics, we're discussing everybody there has made the decision to live, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
once you
that's
make the decision to live, there flows ought. Here's the problem, and now I'm going to go back to self-ownership a little bit for you. Ayn Rand, from that decision about what's good for human life, came up with the concept of egoism. She lays out the values and virtues that are requirements for human life, and she identifies the biggest evil is the initiation of force against other people as being against the interest of the person that does it. But importantly, if somebody initiates force against you, you have the absolute moral authority to defend yourself against that person. So you have to be free to do certain things. And if you're attacked or prevented from doing those things, then you're within your moral authority to defend yourself. Then you have rights. Here's what Rothbard does. Rothbard, and I don't know how much you know about his relationship with Ayn Rand, but this is easily Googleable. You can look it up. In 1957 or 58, he writes Rand a fan letter and tells her that she introduced him to the very concept of natural rights, that without her, he would not have that concept at all. I mean, this letter is very good. In one of the introductions, or one of the prefaces, I'm not sure, of Man, Economy, and State, he writes a letter to the editor, I think maybe the publisher. The Volcker Fund, I believe, is who he wrote it to. He writes this letter in which he says, I previously did not think there could be an objective morality, but now I've been converted to this Randian system. And you're going to see that possibly in my writing, that I now think there's an objective morality. When he writes The Ethics of Liberty, he already had his break with Ayn Rand. I think, I want to say 20 years before. I might be wrong on my numbers, but he had his break with Ayn Rand. If you read The Ethics of Liberty, the influence of Rand is unmistakable. He just doesn't give her credit for it. But in speaking to Walter Block acknowledges the influence. When I interviewed his student, Jeffrey Tucker told me that 4/5 of Rothbard's brain was Ayn Rand. But Rothbard, being the political theorist, only takes the prohibition of initiating force, and then you have the non-aggression principle, right? But there would be none of that. Roy Childs said the same thing. Without Ayn Rand, you'd have no Murray Rothbard. So what the Libertarian Project does, and Hoppe came at it with a different angle, so I'm not going to address Hoppe yet, but what you have is a bastardized objectivism, postulating one of its principles midstream, divorcing it from the rest, and trying to have a coherent political philosophy.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I mean, I'll tell you what, let's for argument's sake, I mean, I do still think that you haven't bridged the Isort gap any different to me, because you're still adding hypothetical imperatives of, if we want to live, and don't get me wrong, they're reasonable hypothetical.
Hold on, that's the only one. That's the only conditional. If you wish to live, and I highly recommend to you and your audience to read Ayn Rand's essay, Causality versus Duty, where she draws the distinction between Kantian duty ethics, which is imposed on you, where you have a duty to act regardless of consequences, and the realistic necessity is what I believe she called her system. I'm about 99% sure, but we're on the fly here, so I might be forgetting. In realistic necessity, it's a teleological ethics that you act with purpose to achieve goals. You start at the beginning. What is the only goal that can act as an end in itself? It's the maintenance of human life. Taking any other goal as your end ultimately leads to your destruction. You start off, because of the possibility of existence and non-existence, there's things that are good and bad for us. If you choose to live, you have to choose the things that are good. Now, that have to obviously doesn't mean if you choose things that aren't good for you, you're going to drop dead on the street, right? I mean, you're necessarily dealing with probabilities. I mean, I can exercise, work out, eat healthy, and die of a heart attack tomorrow. Somebody that smokes cigarettes and just stuffs their face with pizza can live to be 100. But we're talking about what the norm is, what we can deal with. We can't deal with every contingency in life.
Probabilities, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you have to. It's when you're talking about. I mean, I could do everything right and get hit by a car when I leave my house, and then someone can say, "Oh, how did that ethics work out for you?" Okay, but I'm acting on principle, and the principles I'm acting on are the ones most likely to sustain my life across the course of 50, 60, 70, 80 years.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I understand that. I mean, basically, I've got two points. Is one is I don't think that um, like I said, I don't think you've bridged the is-ought gap any different to me because we've both used the hypothetical imperative. My hypothetical imperative. Okay.
No. Your hypothetical imperative came on the other side of the is-ought gap. You postulated something arbitrarily, self-ownership. What I'm saying is the concept of life, in this case, human life, gives rise to the concept of value, something being good or bad that you have to seek, worth seeking, right? Not only that, but it gives rise to the concept of ethics because human beings have to discover and choose to act in accordance with their own lives. Because of that, because you have to do that, you have to choose to live and you have to choose how to live. Those are values, they're things that are good and bad for you. You have ethics. That happens prior to the so-called is-ought gap. We've started with the is. The fact of human life necessitates that human beings have to take certain actions in order to maintain their existence. That's value. You have to discover and choose. That's ethics.
But there's no
That
ought
determines what
attached.
someone ought to. There is. If you want to live,
That's a
you ought
hypothetical.
to do
But
this.
that's a
So,
hypothetical imperative.
but Matthew, who cares? It's conditional. Yes, we're dealing with real life. We're not dealing with a mystical ethics. We're not dealing with something that comes from beyond. We're not dealing with something imposed on us or duties. We're saying that ethics is a code of values to guide human life. If you wish to live, this is the way you ought to. Once you do that, everybody involved in this is wanting to live. If you
I,
don't wish to live, then just don't take the actions, go die, whatever, that's on
yeah.
you. If you wish to live, this is the proper ethics.
Yeah, no, I do. I understand that, but my point is it still is a hypothetical imperative. You might say that it's a superior
I
one
would
to
prefer
mine.
conditional. I would prefer conditional.
Okay,
And
but
it's conditional on a single choice. But ethics is conditional on the capacity to choose. Without it, you don't have ethics anyway. And so what? Once you've made the decision to live, which you've done, now you've crossed the is-ought gap. If you haven't, then nothing is going to make you do it. I don't like why, but why does that preempt the field of crossing the is-ought gap? Why can't it be dependent on the choice to live? Why
well,
does it have to be imposed as if by religion, as some religious entity closing in upon you that
well,
makes you have to do it?
well, because the is-ought gap, as I understand it, is basically saying, look, we can't get our oughts from the ises. So we have all these ises, we have our facts, and
Uh,
none of that. And I know what you're saying about, well, you're saying, well, if we want to live, then those facts do
but
give
is
us our
but
oughts. But
isn't
that's a
that part
hyper.
of the is? Isn't the is? There is a human being who's decided to live. That's an is. Once you have that is, you have an ought.
Well, no, because that's like saying there is a tree that fell down. That
What do you
doesn't mean
mean?
there's, well,
No, because the tree, I don't know how that's irrelevant. I don't even know what I was going to say because I don't know how to respond to it. You have an is, you have
yeah,
human life, right? That needs to be maintained in a certain way. And you have a living entity who has made the choice to live. You now have an ought. From that is, you have an ought.
well, sorry, can you run that? Sorry, I don't mean to be obtuse. Can you run that again?
No, no,
Just
no,
so,
it's okay. It's fine. Human life requires a specific course of action. That's
yeah,
an is. A
yeah.
human being has decided to live, has made that choice to live. That's
Okay.
another is. With those two ises, which really are a single is, a human being living, you have an ought. You
Yeah,
have
but
a whole bunch of oughts, actually, but I mean, just for the simplicity's case, you have the ought.
although
If
you,
the if
sorry, go
if
on.
if the is a person wishes to live, you have your ought.
But what if he doesn't wish to live?
Well, if he doesn't wish to live, then don't do anything. Just die. I mean, what difference does it make? You know what I mean? If somebody doesn't want to live, the topic of ethics doesn't approach him. He doesn't wish to live. I mean, that to me, barring something extreme happening, the idea, because people often raise this question, the idea that a perfectly functioning adult human out of nowhere, for no reason at all, who had previously decided to live, which he must have if he reached adulthood, right? Now, for no reason at all, just says, let me give this up. I mean, that's such an absurdity. Like, I don't even know how to really address it because I can't even really conceive of such a thing. But I mean, but these aren't commands. Objectivist ethics are not commands and they're not duties. If you have such an awful life as to not make it worth living, then by all means end it. There's no duty to stay alive. There's no duty to anybody else that you have to stay alive. But the idea that somebody's just happy and then one day says, fuck it, I'm sorry to swear on your
No, that's right.
podcast.
That's right.
Someone says, that's it, I'm gonna end it. I mean, that's just palpably ridiculous. I mean, people put it forward as an objection, but it just seems so absurd to me.
Look, I understand that I'm not trying to nitpick at this base because, to be honest, I
No,
think
you should.
no, but
You should.
the
Matthew,
re
you should. You should nitpick everything.
well, the
You should
reason,
challenge. That's how you come to your
yeah.
conclusions. That's how you tie them to reality and come to truths.
I mean, the reason why, I mean, part of me almost wants to move on because I feel like there's interesting things to talk beyond this. But the reason why I'm kind of sort of nitpicking at this a little bit is just because agree with pretty much everything you've said in regards to, like, yeah, it would be absurd, and it's not an unreasonable hypothetical imperative or conditional. I think you said it something to characterize it differently, but we're essentially but my point is this is the standard you applied to me. You said, well, I
No,
couldn't
it's
bridge
not.
the is
It
or
really
gap.
isn't. No, it isn't. It isn't. The reason it isn't is because once you have life, you have the concept of value, which is what ethics are all about. The entire subject of ethics deals with values. Value is the primary concept within ethics. Life gives rise to the entire concept of value. Value only makes sense in relation to life. What you were doing was postulating self-ownership and saying because it's the only way you can get to rights. You started with a conclusion and then tried to put forward the hypothetical that was going to get you there. The conditional I'm saying is the entire subject of ethics is about life, about morality. It's about how we live, right? The entire concept of life is what gives rise to the concept of value and the need for an ethical system because we have to learn how to live, how to behave, what to do. And that conditional is one that everybody speaking has already done. Everybody's already decided to live, right? It's an absolute is. These people have chosen to live. Therefore, given the nature of life, given the nature of existence, this is what they ought to do. There's no sort of making anything up or inventing anything.
But
There's no presuppositions. There's only one conditional. If you choose to live, which is the starting point of ethics anyway, is living. I mean, once you're dead, you don't have an ethical system. You have your ought.
I understand that, but when I'm looking at the is or gap, I'm saying you're starting
Mhm.
with your is, you're trying to get to your oughts, and you're saying, well, if you want to live, it comes from that. But
Yeah.
if you want to live as a hypothetical imperative, the
No, I
same
don't.
would
I'm
mean,
not disagreeing. No, it's not
but
the same as with you. It's
but
not the
well, hang
same.
on, let me just explain how I think it is the same,
Mhm.
and then you tell me
Okay.
why I'm wrong. But the reason why I think it's the same is because, from my point of view, we're both stuck on our is island, and we're trying to get to our ought island.
Hmm.
And I'm saying, well, I can sail there with my hypothetical imperative of, if we want such a thing as moral rights, then that's our place to get it. And you're saying, well, my hypothetical imperative that gets me to that island is
Mm.
if we want to live. And you might say that's a better hypothetical imperative, but
No,
it's
I'm not
still
saying
a
it's. I'm not only saying it's
hypothetical
better. I'm saying
imperative.
it's correct. And there's a simple thing. Once you've said I'm over here and I want to find a morality, you've already made the choice to live.
Okay,
You've
that's fair
already
play. Yeah.
decided to live. So once you've made that decision, the oughts come in long before you get to self-ownership.
Yes, but okay, that's fair enough. But it is still a hypothetical
I
imperative
don't, it's a conditional and I don't
or
disagree.
conditional. Yeah.
All I'm saying is it does not matter that once you have that, the supposition that ethics requires something to impose it on you from outside, independent of any choice you make, That's an unwarranted supposition. It's not part of the concept of ethics. It's unrealistic. And if that was the case, there could be no ethics, right? There is nothing outside of us that makes us this is right and wrong. There's no entity deciding what's right and wrong. What we have is life, value, and what is of value. Those are the things confronting us, right? We've decided to live. What do we do next? What's good for me? What's bad for me? That's what we have. That's ethics. We don't need all the other stuff. All the other stuff is mystic fantasy. We have reality, and that's all we need.
But the thing is, as well, but that doesn't really get me to rights though, because it's like if you
We haven't gotten there yet.
okay,
All we've done so far is establish the standard of ethics. The standard of ethics is human life. That's it. That's where we are. You're right. You have not gotten to rights yet. That requires a long chain of reasoning, which I can take you through quickly. But given that, unless you want to be here till the cows come home, or I mean, Rand has written extensively on this. But I will state it, and then you can tell me what you object with to, right? That way we don't have to argue about each point. So Rand identifies as the three fundamental values. And by fundamental, what she means is everything else is determined by these, right? All your other choices need to be decided by these, right? You can't have an ethical system that tells you every single choice that you're going to make. That would be far too cumbersome. So she brings them back to three fundamentals. Reason is one of the fundamental values, and the first one she lists. The reason that you have reason as a fundamental value is because it's your means of survival. Without reason, you right? So you have to have reason as your first value. Purpose. Human beings are goal-directed beings, right? If we don't act with purpose, if we just, whim, do this, do that with no purpose in mind, we can't maintain ourselves. The final is self-esteem, right? Self-esteem she defines as the conviction that I'm both worthy of living and capable of living. But the reason you need self-esteem is because if I don't think myself worthy of living, then why am I going to keep myself alive? And if I don't believe myself capable of it, then why am I going to take the actions that I don't think I'm capable of succeeding at? So those are her three values, right? Reason, purpose, self-esteem. Do you have issue with any of those three?
no, I mean I do think that they're not, there's no kind of what's the word, they're subjective, I still think, but
Well, if the choice has been made to live, right, you need those three things: reason, purpose, and self-esteem. Now, people have them to varying degrees, right? So, but imagine somebody with on a scale with zero, right? If somebody never used reason, never acted with purpose, and had zero self-esteem, right? That person perishes. So, so you can have somebody with very poor self-esteem. You can have somebody who doesn't, always act with purpose, and somebody that behaves irrationally, but you can't do so all the time. To the degree that you did so all the time is the degree you're acting contrary to your life.
um I mean I kind of agree with this on a subjective level, but I don't think any of this is objectively true.
Well, that is what you have to do for yourself. And you're not going to be able to do it in the scope of this conversation. You have to think about it and, analyze if what I'm saying is accurate or not. Do these values, are they necessary for human existence? For a human being to discover those actions necessary for his life? Does he need reason? Does he have to act with purpose? Is self-esteem a necessity? And again, when you say necessity, it doesn't mean either you're going to have the highest self-esteem in the world or you're going to perish. What it means is to the degree your self-esteem is impaired, to that degree you aren't going to take the actions necessary for your flourishing, for your survival, right? That's all it means. Same thing with purpose, same thing with reason. So then those are the values. Now, value is what you pursue, right? But then she comes out with the virtues, the types of actions that you have to take in order to achieve those three fundamental values and in order to maintain your life. The cardinal virtue is rationality, and all the rest of them are components. Rationality meaning that you use logic, you use reason in your life to achieve your goals, right? Then she comes out with productiveness, honesty, integrity, pride, justice, and independence. These are her 6 virtues that you have to have. Now, here's where you get into things. If remember now, productiveness is a virtue, so is independence, so is honesty, integrity. All of these things are virtues. So she comes to the conclusion that to initiate force against another human being is wrong. And you say, why? Well, a person who's initiating force isn't being productive. They definitely by definition aren't acting with integrity because they violated productiveness. They're not being independent because they're dependent on the person on whom they're stealing from, robbing, whatever, unless they're just, caving in somebody's skull for the fun of it. But even in that case, they're not being, they're certainly not being reasonable or rational. So she comes to the conclusion that initiating force is wrong. Now, this is before we ever get to politics, right? We haven't had politics, but now we get to a situation where she says, how should we live together, right? Well, if I have to produce in order to survive, if I have to use reason, if I have to have self-esteem, if I have to be honest, if I have to have integrity and do independent thinking, I have to be free from force. Because if somebody else initiates force against me, it interferes with my ability to maintain myself. It cuts between my rational faculty and existence, and it forces me to do something that I'm not choosing to do, forcing me to do something that my rational mind has not told me to do. So you also will say, well, if somebody does that, do I have the right to use force back at them? Yes, I do. I have the right to defend myself. I have the right to maintain my rationality, to maintain my reason. In order to implement the values and to pursue the values and implement the virtues of objectivism requires freedom. That's where we get rights from. So now, if I have the right to defend myself, well, then the next question is, does the next guy have the right to defend himself? Sure, everybody does. Then we can come together as a group and form what we call a government. And that's a very simplistic way to put it, but it's the easiest way to put it. Government being an organization of collective self-defense that has a monopoly on retaliatory force within a given geographic area. And
What? Sorry.
that's where objectivism, that's the political base. I mean, it's far larger with a far greater defense of capitalism and individual rights and everything, but that's the fundamentals as I understand them.
Okay, we're going to have to finish soon because I know we're getting to the end of our
No, that's
time.
cool. That's all right.
If you're up for it, I'd really love to have another conversation with you because I think
Sure.
there's more meat on this bone.
Just hit me in my DMs. I'll be happy to come back on.
Yeah,
As
I think
long as
sorry, go on.
I do have a lot to do, but I try to make time for these things. I really enjoy them. I think they're important.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be presumptuous for your time, and you've been very kind to
No,
give
no,
me the time you have. But
no. I'd be
I
happy to
think
come
there's
back
more meat
on.
on the bone, so I think it would be worth it. But I
There's
just want
plenty.
to. But before we do wrap up, I just want to kind of ask what. Just, I still have issues with how we got to the rights thing and that, and that's perhaps something we
Sure.
can address when we speak again. But what justifies the monopoly? Like, so we've got to rights. We're kind of on the same page once we got to rights, individual rights and stuff. But what
Okay.
justifies the monopoly?
What justify
I'm with you. Sorry,
okay.
I'm with you on the whole thing. I've got nothing against people collectivizing their self-defense, but
hmm
why the monopoly? What justifies that?
Well, the question is, what is going to render rights most secure, right? We have to have our rights protected. So now I'm going to pose, in this case, the monopoly is justified. To the degree that a government strays from what I'm going to say, it's not justified. And I also know the government does not satisfy my hypothetical, and I also don't believe, I'm not confident it ever will, right? But if you have a government that is limited to protecting the rights of its citizens, meaning every activity within that society is perfectly legal unless you're violating the rights of somebody else. If you have that already, to bring in competition to that necessarily renders rights uncertain, insecure. And I have both plenty of theory to back that up, and I also have history from anarchic societies, whether you look at Viking Age Iceland or you look at what they had in Canada. I don't remember exactly what they were called, tribes and whatnot. But we have the work, say, of Mark Wiener. Mark Wiener said that yes, you can have order and anarchy, but these societies that have order, rights are not protected. These are not free societies. Vincent Colosso has done extensive studies on anarchic societies. He said they're an unstable equilibrium because to the degree that they succeed, they're subject to attack from outside forces who take over. So you either end up with the conquering state or a state rises from within to battle them. And even David Friedman conceded that an anarchic society is not necessarily a libertarian society. So that's just, a little of the empirical work that's been done on the subject, a little of, what David Friedman has said, given his studies extensively on it, and he's an anarchist. And I can go through a variety of hypothetical situations for why I do not think that an anarcho-capitalist society would render rights secure. I mean, anybody that wants to, you can see my debate, for instance, with Walter Block. You can check out my debate with Mike Humer on the subject, or you can even check out my debate with Liquid Zulu on the subject.
Okay, well, I mean, I'll definitely have a look at all of that. I mean, I have actually debated David Friedman myself because I disagree with his assertion that an anarcho-capitalist society doesn't have to be libertarian. I feel that it does because otherwise it's not an anarcho-capitalist society because I feel that it's inherent in the definition. And though I do understand your wariness, but I feel like, and perhaps this is all just stuff that could be good food for thought and that would be a good prep for another, for a follow-on conversation. I mean, you've given me a lot of food for thought, so if I could just perhaps leave you with a couple of little pieces
Sure.
to chew on.
No
but
problem.
yeah, the one of the things I would like to get to, if we do have a second conversation, is the fact that I'd understand your concern. I mean, one of the reasons why this Nations of Sanity project is built on the idea of establishing the non-aggression principles law through a peace agreement is because I feel like we need something to kind of define the society and to kind of have, and we need to have that kind of system of laws. But my problem with the monopoly thing, although I do understand about the competition undermining rights, which is why I feel like the peace agreement would kind of temper that somewhat, but make that more stable. But the problem with a monopoly on rights is I feel like that's more undermining it because it's starting with an immediate violation of rights because you're denying people their right of self-defense by establishing this monopoly
no,
force.
you're not denying their right to self-defense. You're denying them a partial right to self-defense. The only thing that is disallowed is retaliatory force. Because on retaliatory force, you need to have procedures, you need to have objective laws that tell you when retaliatory force is justified, when it's not. You can't just have different people running around implementing retaliatory force that would necessarily mean without trial, without due process. So, like, I believe Matthew has robbed my house. I'm satisfied. I haven't done a real investigation. No one's looked into it. There's no law as far as what I can do, the type of search I can do, or anything like that. So can I just go retaliate against Matthew and then I go and beat the crap out of Matthew and then it turns out it was Joe? You know what I mean? You have to have procedures in place. So even under the best anarcho-capitalist society, that right is going to be stripped from individuals. You're not going to have individuals if you do, then you really don't have defense agencies because the people can do whatever they want anyways. And I can, if I think that I'm right, I just go do it and that's the end of it. I go
Well,
retaliate. It's
well,
only retaliatory force that the government has the monopoly on in a ideal objectivist society.
yeah, I understand that, but even if it's a small violation, that's where I liken it to the Minikism problem of
Sure.
there's that little
But this
contradiction.
gets to really the sort of the nub of it, right? We're not deontologists. We don't have duties, right? Ethics arise in a given context. The entire purpose of ethics is so human beings' rights are secure, so they can live, so they can flourish, and make their own free decisions, right? If you don't have a government with retaliatory force, if we're going to be rationalistic deontologists about this and say, no, NAP, and just, no, you cannot have a monopoly, right? We're throwing out the entire edifice in the name of duty so that we end up in a situation where none of us has rights because we're saying we have a right to establish these organizations. By the way, I would argue the contrary. If you had an anarcho-capitalist society where all rights were secure, as secure as they can be. Obviously,
Sure. Yeah.
individuals violate each other's rights, but if none of the agencies are rights violating, all they're doing is protecting it. And then, Joe comes aside and says, "Hey, I'm going to start a state now, and we're going to have a monopoly." Those anarchic people would have every right to stop him from
Yeah.
doing it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because he's now rendering their rights uncertain. The inherent thing is if you, the only time this even becomes an issue, right? Because you can hire defense agencies right now, and you would be able to in a minarchist society. When it becomes an issue is when somebody who is subscribes to the government, who accepts the government's authority, that person runs into conflict. Say that person gets mugged by somebody who has a separate defense agency. The two are not going to be on equal footing to decide this. You're going to have one arbiter, and that is going to be the rights respecting government, and that government has the right to do that. I don't like to use the word rights because that seems collective. That government would be morally just as long as it held to the proper procedures and laws that it needed to in order to ensure a just conviction. If it doesn't do that, then it's illegitimate anyways. And if it's not, to the degree it's not limiting itself to rights protections, it's illegitimate.
I would say that that same standard that you're saying would kind of guard against,
Mm.
would disqualify the government, would also disqualify all these defense agencies in what I'm proposing. You know what I mean? Like, so if they weren't doing that due diligence to make sure that they were convicting people with a beyond reasonable doubt, certainty of their guilt and stuff like that, and with a
Sure.
proper, so because that's the
Mhm.
thing, because a lot of people say to me, oh, like, in this kind of free society, what happens if people do punish people, but they don't have, they do it in their own kangaroo courts or whatever? It's like, well, then they would be guilty of kidnapping and assaulting and all the things that
But so
would.
what?
What do you mean?
So
So
what?
what? Well, that would
What
be
I
what the
what
temper such
what I
things.
what, what I mean is what I mean by that is if you have one monopoly government and you have one small defense agency tries to do that, that monopoly government can handle that, right? It can stop that from happening. If you have multiple competing defense agencies, none of which is some of which I guess are slightly more powerful than the next, and you have, say, a defense agency that's formed by criminals, which essentially is the mafia, right? You have the mafia. The mafia existed to protect criminals so that criminals wouldn't get robbed, they wouldn't get shot, whatever. They can run their criminal enterprises. So the mafia is there to protect them. It's a defense agency, a rather large and powerful one at that. That was only be able to be brought down by a large monopoly government. One, in fact, that was willing, probably, not probably, but to, violate rights. I mean, they took Gotti's lawyer away from, for instance, as one, example. But if you have the mafia and you have a bunch of defense agencies, they're going to have a very hard time putting that mafia out of business unless they come together and form a union, in which case you basically have a government anyways.
But the problem with the monopoly force, and I know we've got to wrap this up, but the problem with the monopoly force is, I mean, and I know I'm not straw manning you because I know you're not advocating for the government we have right now,
No, I'm not.
but it is demonstrated by the fact that we don't have any of this accountability. And part of the reason why we don't have this
No
accountability is
argument for me.
because, but part of the reason for that is that monopoly on force. It's because
Well,
we
that's not
have.
why. That's not why. I don't like to interrupt, but sometimes I have to, right? Because you're going to get too far from the
Yeah, no, it's
point, and
fine. Yeah.
I want to stop you at this point. The problem what we have now, right, and what we have with anything, you need to have the bulk of the citizenry behind it, right? The bulk of the citizenry has to support the society, at least a very vehement minority, right? If you have 40% are vehement and the rest are indifferent, you could do it. My point still stands that the people that are going to be governed in this way have to come to agree to it. That's true of whether it be anarchy, my system, whatever, right? So as long as the people right now want the government to be their employer, they want the government to pay for their health care, for their retirement, as long as we have that, then both of us are dead in the water, which I think we probably are. I hope not. I hope that people come around and come to value liberty, but until they do, we're stuck anyway. The entire enterprise for either of us is contingent on convincing enough people that we need to have a free society.
Sure, I understand that, and my own project's built on a similar thing of obviously trying to get this peace agreement to
Sure.
establish the Napper's law. But my point is when you've got that, that would still need the majority of people, and I'm not, because the thing is, I mean, I had a debate once with another objectivist to the point where, and I think we're in a similar impasse here, is where we kind of both agree that yes, it would be better to have like a kind of majority collective, if you like, but it's just the monopoly aspect that I'm comfortable with. I mean, I'm quite happy for us to have like a large, say, public serving collective that's very much like government in that sense, but not in the sense of the rights violating monopoly on force, so that there can still be competition, because that would be what, in my mind, would temper the corruption. You know what I mean? If the voluntary, like for example, if my UK government became a voluntary collective tomorrow, but carried on as it was, I'm no longer paying into it, I'm no longer a part of it, and I'm going to start funding a security agency that actually follows a law that, you know, that is just and what have you. So I feel like the competition is a better guard against this kind of the problems that you talk about, because a lot of these problems exist today. I know you say that that's not because of the monopoly on force, and we're probably running out of time to really get into perhaps why you think that is, and maybe we should put a pin in that, but that's kind of my concern, if you like.
How about this? The next time you can have me on, and I'll come on and I'll tell you all my objections or critiques of anarcho-capitalism and why I don't think it could produce the kind of results that its advocates say it can.
Okay, if you do, could I ask that you perhaps pay particular mind to specifically what the Nations of Sanity project, because I'm not advocating what David Friedman advocates.
No, that's fine. But you're gonna have to send me, or tell me where to go so I can read the stuff. But I have no problem doing that.
Yeah, I'll send you a link. I mean, but it is pretty simple. It's just based on the idea, let's make the non-aggression principle the law through a peace agreement, because it should be the law. It's the only justifiable law, but obviously we can't do it through a rule in government, because that kind of contradicts the principle, at least as far as I'm concerned. So do it through a peace agreement, you know, like a peace treaty or something like that. So it's the terms of peace between all people. But the non-aggression principle should be the law. So like I say, I'm similar to objectivists in feeling like we need to have that kind of law and order, but I don't want a monopoly for anyone having them, because I don't feel there's any justification for it. And I also feel that it would cause more problems than it solves, in the sense of the sort of things you're alluding to. But perhaps that's something that we could tackle in a second conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
All right, buddy. Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you taking the time, and I really appreciate this. I'll have a good think about everything you said, and I hope I've given you a bit of food for thought, and I'll get in touch and hopefully speak again.
All right. Take care of yourself.
Thank you, Michael. Cheers.